So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this session on climate change policy. My name is Jean Fourré, and I am an economist at the OECD. Iman Akiki from the Center of Global Trade Analysis is hosting and recording today's session, and will help ensure we keep to our allotted time. Before getting to the presentation, please allow me to remind everyone of the following session protocol, in case you were not present yesterday and didn't heard it 4 times. So all attendees except the current person speaking must remain muted. And unless otherwise noted, the presentations will last 20 minutes. The session host, so Iman, will verbally prompt the presenter when there are 2 minutes remaining in their allotted time. When the allotted presentation time has elapsed, if the presentation has not really ended, the host will prompt again, and I will immediately move us onto the discussion period. The discussion will last for 10 minutes and follow immediately after each presentation. The listener must enter their questions or comments to everyone in the chat board, and I will accept the questions in the order that they arrive. And allow the presenters to respond verbally. And between 2 sessions, we will have a bit of time to prepare the next presentation. So today we will hear from 4 different presenters, and due to schedule constraints, we have changed the order in which they will be presenting. So, first, without further ado, please let me introduce the first speaker, Husheng Wu from the University of Copenhagen. So Husheng, the floor is yours. Thank you. I think you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for excuse me. So this is a paper that I co-authored with my PhD student Francesco. We participated in a large EU Horizon 2020 project where we are tasked with evaluating the transboundary effects or external effects of a large set of European decarbonization pathways towards 2050. And from that exercise, we were able to draw out a set of results regarding the emission reductions in the EU, the competitiveness effects, as well as the leakage effects. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Before I move on to is it working? Yeah. Modeling efforts. Let me just remind people about how decarbonization pathways are actually formulated in reality. Of course, it is mainly politics, but researchers do have something to say. So what I'm showing here are 2 screenshots taken from the Danish Climate Council's proposal on how to decarbonizing the Danish economy towards 2030, aiming at reducing the Danish emissions by 70% already in 2030. And at the left-hand side, you can see that we have a lot of sectoral details. Where are the emission reduction in terms of millions of tons coming from? So different sectors. On the right hand side is another screenshot. It basically shows that, well, the things that we can do, we know that we can do from the various sectors are not enough. We have to deploy new technologies which have certain probabilities for succeeding. Okay, so the message here is that the actual decarbonization pathways in reality are built with sectoral details, with also technological details. Based on that, one key message that I want to put already at the very front is we need a lot of instruments to make this happen. not just carbon pricing. Okay, so that's basically the background. Now, going forward to my topic of decarbonizing the EU economies here, and obviously we have the overall targets, but these targets in reality must be decomposed into actionable sub-targets across sectors. And then once you are there, then there are potentially numerous pathways for reaching a given overall target, and the pathways are very likely to differ significantly across member states. Then how do we model that? And here we have many CG modelers at this conference here, and people are definitely familiar with using carbon pricing instruments to realizing a given reduction targets. But I would argue that it is unrealistic to imagine one effectively uniform carbon pricing that would actually cover in all sectors. In any case, I think, as I just demonstrated earlier, the decarbonization pathways, they contain many other elements. So that gets me to discuss the bottom-up models. We have lots of those models. The one that I worked with in the past few years, the EU calculated model, is one such example, and they have a lot of details at a sectoral, technological level that can be used to formulate concrete pathways, which can then be evaluated using the economic models. So our approach here is to propose a slightly modified CG model that is more flexible, which can be used to analyze pathways formulated from the detailed bottom-up inputs. And the specific objective here is to evaluate the external impacts of a large set. In this case, we're referring to 31 decarbonization pathways. Here I replaced the EU with the European because the scope of the project covers EU 27, but also includes the UK as well as Switzerland, so it's EU +2. Methods, we taking as a departure point of the GTAP model, made quite a few changes, implementing shifters in the demand and the production systems. We also have other features, other accounting equations, things on long CO2 emissions, etc. Then we established the business as usual baseline in 2050. Here we surveyed a lot of exogenous projections around the SSFE2. I imagine that John, you actually have a lot of work on those things. So we certainly benefited from that as well. And then we formulate scenarios using the pathways from the EU calculated model, which I'm going to discuss a bit more. So each pathway contains 50 sets of levers at 4 so-called ambition levels in each of these pathways. And then we have to find ways to incorporate these changes into the CG model. So that's basically what we did. But here, my goal here is to talk about the results rather than spending a lot of time on the nitty-gritties on how these things are done. But believe me, Francesco has spent a lot of time playing with these different pieces. So the data source from the EU calculated model. EU calculated model is a engineering type of model that contains demand drivers on lifestyle choices that is driving the supply in the various sectors, and those which in turn creates energy demand and emissions. And then here we have a lot of technological details on the energy system, as well as on the various energy intensive sectors. So this is how the whole thing was putting together. And then, of course, what we have done here is that basically at the periphery of this, the core modules, where we are looking at what that means for the EU's economic dependencies with the rest of the world, including the emissions embodied in the trade flows. So that's basically what we did. Here, it is important to just to emphasize the concepts. Pathways, a set of lever settings covering different sectors. Okay, I mentioned the demand side, supply side, as well as the outcomes. The levers are the key behavior and the technological variables associated with a particular set of sector or sectors that can be changed to induce changes in the outcomes. Ambition levels refers to the levels that we set for each of these behavior parameters. 1 for trend, 2 intermediate ambition, 3 very high but still realistic ambitions, 4 is the transformational changes. And these are defined through literature. We also run a whole set of workshops to validate these assumptions with sector experts and stakeholders. And then what it does, of course, is that any user can go online and play with these levers and change the ambition levels, and then you can see the outcomes. So we have this online interface. All right, let me just go to what I want to do here. Basically, this tool can generate an unlimited number of decarbonization pathways. But obviously, if you're running CGE model, you know that you can't actually do that. So here we select 31 pathways for our modeling exercise here. And the first set is just contains the uniform lever settings for the demand side and for the supply side, and increasing them across the different pathways. Second set, we have asymmetric demand and supply efforts, just showing that how if we push the demand more, supply less, what is going to happen with respect to the emission reduction targets, as well as how we trade with the rest of the world. Set 3 is what I call the tangle 1 second at a time scenario, where we match the demand and supply of a particular sector at a time, okay, allowing the other sectors staying at the same level. So that's why we have this 31 scenarios, and you could also grouping them in different ways. One way to do this is to fix in the demand ambitions. Okay, for example, we said in group D1, we set all the demand ambitions to 1, and then we started to change the supply side ambitions from 1 all the way to 4. So we have 4 such groups. But if you look at these 4 groups vertically, each column, okay, then you have a different view. And then in this case, you are in fact fixing the supply side ambitions, right? And then allowing the demand side ambitions to change from 1 to 4, okay? So that's basically what we have in the lower half of this textbooks here. So that's also the way that we're going to guide our analysis. Going to the results, so this results is for a particular decarbonization pathway P4, that where we have all the levers set at the transformation ambition level for all the demand and the supply levers. And we're looking at the change in the EU's external trade balance here. And on the left-hand side, you can look at how the EU's trade balance is going to change with the rest of the world. For instance, if you look at Russia, all right, in fact, the EU is going to improve its trade position with Russia. Why is that? And this is simply because in P4, we're going to have drastic reductions in fossil fuels, and then we're going to reduce our dependency on imports from those countries. On the other hand, we're going to have very large trade deficit with the Chinese, with the Americans, the ones who are competitors with us in the areas of manufacturing and services, okay? And in fact, if you look at the right-hand side, then it is quite clear what is driving the results is from a worsening of the manufacturing trade balance with the rest of the world as a whole, simply because we place much more burden on our ability to produce manufacturing products, reducing its production activity levels. But the services were also suffering a trade deficit. Why is that? This is for another reason. As the European consumers are reallocating their expenditure share away from emission-intensive products, they must place more expenditure on less emission-intensive service activities. So that's actually, roughly speaking, that's the mechanism here. And so this basically says that, well, the trade balance will be reduced by $863 billion, corresponding to a carbon leakage rate of more than 60%. And that's not a small deal when we're talking about policy. So this is the main results that I want to show you here. So what we are plotting here is, in fact, to get the main results in this one graph and look at 2 dimensions. One such dimension is the change in the GHG emissions. So this is the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the change in the external trade balances, and we have in proportionally large area for the third quadrant. So this is the southwestern quadrant here. This is because we're going to see reductions on the vertical direction, the emissions, also reductions on horizontal directions. That's the trade balance. Okay. The first lines that I'm showing here is essentially the group D1. If you remember that, we are demand at the ambition 1, supply, we're changing that. So if you keep demand at 1 and you are increasing the ambitions on the supply side, then we started to see the movements to the southwestern directions, meaning that we're going to have achieving the emission reduction goal, but at the same time we are making the trade balance worse, right? So that's what shows here. And group 2 is similar patterns. Group 3, group 4. Okay. So so if you connect these lines here, the 4 different D groups here, so you get this nice shaped line here, just showing how things are moving. But that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to look at the supply groupings. And supply grouping means that we're keeping the supply levers constant and manipulate the demand. And then these are these blue lines here. Okay. So in general, we're moving to the southeastern direction here, meaning that we're going to see reductions in emission, at the same time reductions of the trade deficit. Okay. One thing that is interesting here is that the curvature, the slopes of these blue lines, that's changing. Okay. So when the supply side ambitions are placed at lowest level, this is actually worse than the EU reference scenario, basically. Okay, so you emit more initially. Then you don't really change the trade balance very much, but you are changing the emissions if you have more demand side mitigation measures. Okay. Whereas when you are at level 4 for your supply side emission reductions, then any additional demand side force will not change in the emission level very much, but it will actually reduce the trade balance deficit. Okay, so this is just the main message coming out of this graph here. So and then I think the next one here is rather trivial here. So this is basically just shows that we have the higher carbon leakage rates associated with worsening trade balance. So if we have more trade deficit, we're going to have more carbon leakage. And if we have higher decarbonization ambitions, which reduces more greenhouse gas emission in Europe, then of course we're going to have higher carbon leakage rates up to 2/3. Okay, so and then I think I'm just going to offer my conclusions. If you are still with me, the first message is that deep decarbonization in Europe, not just the EU, but also UK and Switzerland, of course, it is possible, but it requires the highest ambitions. And here in our simulations, we can get up to 64% reductions against the baseline. And I need to remind people that this 64% reduction does not include any not much land use changes. We don't consider carbon capture and the carbon storage, things like that. So that's one of the reasons that this is not net zero. And then clearly there are also differential transboundary effects across sectors. That's not surprising either. Looking at demand supply actions here, and we need to do both. Simply just having a burden all on the supply side is clearly not enough. We need consumers changing their lifestyles, and this obviously we have seen a lot of talks from the popular movements, but in reality, whether a lot of people are willing to give up their cars, their big house, their beef steaks, and then that's another question. Number 4 is the competitive concerns. I think from these exercises, if we are assuming that the rest of the world is not going to do what we do in the EU, then those concerns will be real. And the leakage are likely to be large, okay? Up to 2/3 of the EU's emission reductions can be actually leaked to the rest of the world if the rest of the world doesn't really do very much. And then the last point here, I think this modest modeling exercise that we're doing and trying to take advantage of the large set of pathways considered in the EU calculated model, bottom-up model, engineering type model. I think, in fact, they're actually quite useful. They bring us a bit closer to what actually being discussed. Okay, in the policy debate, rather than simply say that, well, let's have a carbon price. Okay, so that's not my last point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hu Sheng, for this very interesting presentation. We will go ahead with the questions. So as a reminder, please use the chat to ask the questions you want, and I will take them in the order that they appear. So actually, we have a first question by Cedric Hodge, who asks, did you do any analysis on varying the pace of global actions and or the EU imposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism at the same time?
No. So the issue about the border carbon adjustment, I think Francesco and I, also Irvin from Purdue, we have done a new work, which is presented, is going to be presented in another session now. So I think the result here is really based on the design, what kind of BCA you're going to have based on which countries' carbon emission intensities, whether or not you are allowing differentiations across sectors, also across exporters. That matter a lot. I think it's really in the details. But you mentioned 2 things. I missed the first one.
The first one was about the global ambition. So what is the assumption that you have?
The assumption here is simply that they are at the business as usual, so they don't have additional climate policy. So that's what is driving, and perhaps that makes the leakage rate seems to be particularly high, and the trade balance seems to be particularly large, simply because we haven't got time to create a more realistic global scenario. But also remember that when we are doing this, and we have no idea how where the Americans are going to move under the Trump administration, for instance.
So we have another question from Rafael Garrafa, who is asking, what were the main driver of the trade balance losses? Any supply chain disruptions are identified?
Well, so if just coming back to the illustrative example that I given at the beginning of my discussion of the results, I think one thing here is that certainly the demand for fossil fuel in the EU is a big deal. And also the way that we will have to change our manufacturing and energy systems would have cost implications, as well as how the scale effects in terms of how much we're going to produce. And that would actually implies the way that we trade manufacturing, which in the ambitious supply side scenario means that we would have to import rather than export. And then looking at the demand side, of course, is also very, very important. And the cost and also the level of productions in the EU of the various emission-intensive products, okay, can potentially be sourced at a cheaper price from the rest of the world. That's one thing here. Certainly, also the demand side drivers also concerns how much consumers are going to consume and what kind of things they're going to consume. That also matters.
Thank you. We have another question from Iman, who asks if you could briefly tell us how do you model the saving, investment, and capital formation. And if I may just build up on this question and ask you about the model closure. So what is, because very often we fix the trade balance. So how did you handle that?
Yeah. If I started with the trade balance discussion here, we allow trade balance obviously to adjust. So if we fixed trade balance, then we wouldn't have a story to look into carbon leakages. And in fact, I have some debate with some of my colleagues here. And in our department, we have one professor is the vice chair of the Danish Climate Council, and the other one is the chairman of the Danish Economic Council. They're also looking at the same results. Then they argue that, well, you shouldn't have a fixed, should have a fixed trade balance simply because the exchange rate mechanism would not sustain very large trade deficit. But my response to that question is that trade imbalance is the norm. Balanced trade is the exception. You don't see any country has balanced trade, any large economies. That means also the exchange rate adjusts. It's a very complex macroeconomic phenomenon here, and it also requires some other discretionary actions. If you look at the Chinese case, for instance, so that's what we have to live with. I think even if you have those macroeconomic mechanisms to decrease the trade balance, that would be a response, right, to those. The change in the trade balance. If you can get into a situation where you have a problem with your balance of payments, then some other things would have to happen. But it happens afterwards. So that would be. But Iman's points about capital formation and also.
Yes. How did you model the saving, investment, and capital formation? So the.
Yeah, I think we pretty much have the standard because this is still a static framework. Okay, so we have the standard GTAP setting here, but obviously things are a little bit different when we are doing the baseline, because then you have to have capital formation to happen in a long period. So. But Francesco would have more details on how he actually done that.
Okay. We have 1 or 2 minutes. If there is last questions, can pop off the chat. But otherwise, thank you very much for this presentation. And we will switch to the next presenter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wusheng.
Thank you.
So for those who just joined us, we switched the first and the fourth presenters. So sorry if there is it's not very convenient for you, but it was for agenda reasons. So we will go on with the regular order with Somya Matter, which is, sorry if I don't pronounce well your name, which is from the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Somya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean.
So we don't see yet your screen, but it is loading.
Yeah.
Yeah, take your time, Ginger. Allow us to have a couple of minutes for this transition.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
I think we have to wait. Oh no, it's 12:33. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Soumya Mathur. I'm working as a senior economist with Infinite Sum Modeling. It's a research-based consultancy firm in Seattle. I'm also working for a think tank which is working on climate change in Pune, India. My co-authors are Dr. Ricardo Barcinola. He's a professor with Asian Institute of Management. Dr. Badri Narayan, he's the founder of Infinite Sum Modeling. And Dr. Rahul Sen, he's a senior lecturer at Auckland University of Technology. So today I'm going to present you our work. It's still a working paper. It's based on the role of private investors in climate finance from the perspective of renewable energy technologies. So what basically drives the private investors to invest in renewable energy technologies? So this is our work. So if you see here, the share of hydropower is the highest in renewable energy generation in the world. Just a second, I'll minimize the screen. Wind and solar energies have grown since 2010, but still hydropower has a very large share. The share of renewable energy investments has grown and is the highest in East Asia and Pacific. It has been driven by China, which has attracted around 32% of the renewable energy investments, followed by Western European countries and US and Canada. The share of Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa is still very low and has remained consistent over the years. The annual financial commitments in renewable energies of solar and wind power is, they have a very high share in that as compared to other renewable energy sources. The investments in renewable energy by private investors have risen, and as compared to public sector, private sector has a very large share. In 2018, out of $322 billion US dollars, around $300 billion were invested by private sector. So if we want to achieve the low carbon pathway by 2050, so we have to increase the investments in renewable energies by almost by double the amount which we are investing, which the countries plan to invest in planned energy scenarios now. So private investments can be done by corporations, retail investors, investment firms, financial intermediaries like banks, insurance companies, pension funds, endowment funds. So how can we, what are the factors which drive the private investor to invest in renewable energy technologies? So any investor while investing would always consider risk and returns while investing in a project. So using the GTAP e-power model, we have used the GTAP e-power model in our analysis. And we have used the GTAP framework to analyze how these two factors affect the investments, the risk and the rewards. So we have used the GTAP e-power model, and the region groupings are annexure 1 countries, emerging economies, Middle East, and these other regional groups like Latin America, Africa. So annexure 1 countries, emerging economies, and Middle East, we have disaggregated them. We know that GTAP e-power model has disaggregated energy sectors. So renewable energy sectors are there, fossil fuel sectors are there, and there are the basic the other sectors which are also there in the standard GTAP model. So the first simulation which I've done is reduction of costs. Cost can be, the reduction in levelized cost of electricity generation, which comprises of cost of equipment and fixed and variable operating and maintenance costs. So we see here that the cost of power and solar power and wind energy has constantly been declining over the years. So for the first simulations, the assumptions what we have done are like we have assumed that some employment does exist in the world economy, and as per the International Renewable Agency report, solar power costs have already reduced by 82% in the last decade, and a further decline would happen by 15 to 35%. So for shocking the cost reduction, we have taken an average of 20%, assuming that already a lot of technological advancements and a lot of cost reduction has been done in solar energy sector. So we can assume that further decline would be by 20%. Wind electricity costs have gone down by 32% and biomass by 13.15% in the last decades. So we assume that this trend would continue in the future as well. We assume that the productivity of capital in these renewable energy sectors is augmented by technological changes, due to which cost reduction happens. So that is the reason we have made the cost of renewables exogenous and swapped price variable with the productivity variable. The net rate of return on capital stock of renewables we have calculated using this equation. And here are the results. So as we see here, the advanced annexure 1 countries, they have a higher rate of return as compared to the emerging economies here. India is taking the lead, of course. The rate of return on capital investments in India is growing. And the share, the rate of return in Latin America and Africa is still very low. And as we see here also, in the Middle Eastern countries also, the share of, the percentage rate of return on capital is very low. So we see how much has been, what are the changes in the generation capacity of the renewable energy, of wind, bioenergy, and solar. So here also we see that the advanced economies, the annexure 1 countries, they have a higher percentage change of power generation as compared to countries like Africa and emerging economies here. But those were the percentage changes. If we see this graph, we see the actual change in renewable energy generation due to cost reduction. So here the advanced economies have the scale of operations in advanced economies is much higher as compared to emerging economies, and it is very low in Middle Eastern countries. It's not showing here, but it's very low. The percentage change in GDP due to cost reduction has been higher in Annexure 1 countries as compared to emerging economies here, and has been very low in the other countries like Africa, Latin America. Welfare changes have also, similarly, the welfare changes have also been very high in US and Annexure 1 countries as compared to emerging and developing economies. So the second simulation which we have done is mitigating the country risk. Country risk comprise of sovereign risk, economic risk, and political risk. So to eliminate country risk, we can, have enabling policies. We can provide political risk insurance to the investors and have some financial, we can insulate the investors through these financial instruments. So for simulating the country risk, we have used this paper by Malcolm, and this paper describes a technique which can be used to examine the impact of changes in country risk. So Malcolm has used risk premium as the primary factor responsible for the changes in investment levels. So the expected rate of return is equal to the global rate of return and risk premium. So we have taken this variable and interpreted as risk premium. Malcolm's paper has done that. So we have made rate of return, expected rate of return as an endogenous variable, exogenous variable, and swapped with CDS slash this variable. And the assumptions which we have used is that some unemployment exists in the economy. So the data which we have taken for country risk premium is from this paper by Professor Ashwath Damodaran of NYU Stern School of Business. And he has provided a data on the country risk in the year 2019. So as per Professor Damodaran, countries shown in red and brown color, they are high-risk countries, and countries with dark green color in US, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, they have very low risk, so the risk premium is almost zero. Country risk premium is zero. So we have taken two scenarios. The first is a very ambitious scenario of complete elimination of country risk. So when we reduce the country risk by zero, it is reduced to zero. So countries in emerging economies and the developing countries, the Middle Eastern countries, Iran has a very high risk premium. So the demand for capital in these countries increases when we reduce the country risk premium. When we eliminate the country risk premium. So this was for wind power, and similarly we can see for solar power, biomass, the same trend has almost continued throughout. The percentage increase in GDP due to elimination of country risk has been higher in Middle Eastern and developing economies due to elimination of country risk, because there is, there will be a spur of economic activities, and due to which GDP increases more. the welfare impacts are also there more in these countries. Now we've taken the other moderately ambitious scenario of elimination of country risk by 50%. Here also similarly, we see a higher demand for capital in renewable energies in these emerging economies and Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Turkey. GDP also, change in GDP is higher in emerging economies and Middle Eastern countries. Similarly, welfare also shows the same pattern. So the other ways which we can mobilize. So the main, I would like to conclude by saying that though the cost reductions and we can take care of eliminating or reducing country risk by various financial instruments, but the scale of operations, the scale of investments are required to be higher in developing economies and emerging markets so as to achieve the low carbon pathway. So the other ways through which we can mobilize private investments are by reducing tax incentives, through providing tax incentives to domestic investors, through making the complex project contracts, the procedure of project contracts simpler, and having standardized contracts, through floating green bonds and promoting sustainable energy trade agreements between countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soumya, for this very interesting presentation. So we will turn to the discussion, so please feel free to use the chat. I don't see any question yet, so I will start with one of my own. I was wondering, there is one?
I can't see.
Yes, okay. So Iman says, could you talk about CGD Slack a bit more? What is it swapped for?
Just a second. I can't see the screen with where the chats are. Sorry.
Sorry, what is the problem?
I'm saying I can't see the chat and the screen.
Yeah, but I can read it.
I can see.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see it now. Yeah. So what was the question?
The question was about CGD Slack and what it is swapped for. If you could elaborate.
CGD Slack, Malcolm has interpreted as risk premium, and it is swapped with a rate of expected rate of return. So that's it.
Okay, so we have another question by Cedric Hodge. So what role, if any, do you think the announcement of net zero targets by various countries play in encouraging investment? Is it different for legislated targets?
What role, if you... Yes, they do play a significant role. They play a very significant role. Like, as I said, the countries right now are already making a lot of changes, advancing, doing technological changes and putting a lot of investments in renewable energy technologies. So currently, the investments are as per the targets, which the countries have already. But to what I'm saying is, like, if we want to achieve the low emission pathway and have climate temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade, then we need a very higher rate of investments. The scale of investments needs to go up in that case.
Thank you. So Rafael Garrafa from the JRC is telling us that climate finance is quite a broad concept. So his question is related to the source of capital cost reduction in developing countries. Did you also account for aid from developed countries or only private investment from INA reports?
Only for private investments.
Okay, and if I may add on these questions, the amount of investment that you trigger by your simulation, is it something that you compared to the investment requirements you were mentioning at the beginning of the presentation? So is it sufficient to have enough financing for renewables, or do we still need to do more than what you simulated?
We need to do a lot more than what we have simulated, because as I showed you, the scale of operations, even if we decrease the cost, reduce the cost, even after that we need to the investments are not enough. So to increase the scale of operations, we have to increase the scale of investments. We need to have more than what we have simulated.
Okay. So another question from Rafael Garrafa. So he's asking whether you made the rate of return endogenous to the model in the risk premium analysis.
Yes, we did that. That's also shown here. I have also mentioned in my slides that it is expected rate of return is made endogenous. Sorry, the expected rate has been made exogenous by swapping the rate of CGDS slack.
Okay, thank you. I have a question, if there is no more in the chat, on the reduction in costs. Do you have an idea of what are the drivers of the current reduction? Is it pure technology, or is it because of public intervention? And how do you think this could impact your results depending on the way costs are reduced for renewables?
In our model, and what I feel is technology plays a very important role. So more, it's not just investment in renewable energy technologies, but it is also, more investment should also go in R&D, research and development of these technologies. So the technological advancements play a very significant role. It plays a more important role rather than other factors. So the main drivers of reducing cost is technological advancements.
And do you have an idea of the costs of this investment in R&D, or is it already embedded in your simulations?
No, it is not embedded in my simulations. We are still working on it. So the work which we have done so far doesn't account for that.
Okay, thank you. So we still have a couple of minutes for questions, so please feel free to use the chat. And we have one from Cedric Hodge, which is a follow-up, which is, do you have a view on how much technical improvement will be a function of policy versus private sector sentiment, like with green hedge funds, etc.?
No, we have not taken that into account, yes, but I'll have to look into it. As of now, we haven't done that much. Yeah. So as I said, that it's a work in progress, so that aspect we have to consider and work on that issue.
Okay, thank you. And just a clarification question I had on the beginning of your presentation. You were mentioning the required investment for a low carbon economy. So were you considering, let's say, net zero emission compatible scenarios, or is it another type of scenario which you used as your reference for the required investment?
We have just taken a static situation, like if we have not considered net zero emissions scenario. We have just taken, like, if the costs are reduced by say 32% or 13% in the case of biomass, then what the level of investments will be. Like, assuming that in the last decade this was the trend of decline in the costs. So if a further decline of cost by 35% or 32%, then what would be the scenario?
Okay.
So we've not taken that net zero emission scenario into account.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question from Iman, which is, have you thought about likely impact of lower crude oil prices?
No, we haven't. But yes, in our work further, we will be considering that as well. And also about not just that, we also plan to work on, we have just included a country risk, but we plan in our future work, we will be including energy transition risk. So what is how much, naturally the Middle Eastern countries would be having higher transition risk. So we will take that into account as, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think we will take 2 minutes to make the transitions, unless there is a last question popping in the chat. And otherwise, I will thank you, Soumya, for this very interesting presentation and discussion. And we will switch to the next presenter, which I think is Marcos, and he joined us. Could you confirm you are here, Marcos?
Hello, I am here.
Hello. You can take a few minutes to prepare, to check if everything is working with your presentation, and we will start at 5 past the current hour, which is 1 p.m. for me, but which might not be the same for you all.
Yes, okay, I understand.
Have you already tried to share something? It's beginning. So we see perfectly your screen, but it's not in full screen mode. Is it normal? Okay, I think it will be perfect. I think we wait for a couple of minutes to stay on on the schedule. So I think we can start. So let me introduce you the next presenter, which is Marcos Gonzalez Auhing. So he's going to present us his work on towards a low emission economy, the role of abatement targets and carbon taxes. Marcos is from the University EAFIT. So Marcos, the floor is yours.
You're muted, Marcos.
Okay,
Come.
perfect. Right now. Hello, everyone. My name is Marco Gonzalez Aujín. I am a master's student in economics at Universidad de AFIT in Medellin, Colombia. I'm going to present the paper toward a low emission economy, the law of abatement, target, and carbon taxes. I work it with the professors Jesus Botero and Álvaro Hurtado. Today is my first time in a GTAP conference, and also it is my first work with a CGE model. So we appreciate your feedback in the end. In the agenda, I'm going to start with an introduction. Then I'm going to explain about the greenhouse gases in Colombia, literature review, the description model, the result, and the conclusion. Okay. First, I would like to begin with a motivation and why it is important to analyze environmental lives. Is first the greenhouse gases emissions and the world average temperature have record levels, and this has environmental consequences, such as the ocean warming, the loss of Arctic ice, the rise in sea levels, and also affect the agriculture. For that reason, 192 countries signed the Paris Agreement, which aims to reduce the greenhouse gases emissions to keep the average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. So mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. However, it would affect the GDP growth, the employment, the household welfare levels, and the economic structure. But it is estimated to be less than inaction with global warming. So we analyze the economy's impact of the carbon tax and environment target using CGE model for the Colombia economy, and we prepared a sent with 12 sector use information of 2018. First, Colombia commit to reduce its greenhouse gases by 21% of emission production for 2030, but in the last December, the Colombia government update their goals and they commit to reduce it by 51%. I think it's very difficult to reduce the 51%, but the most of emission in Colombia come from the A4 sector, which is 55% of the total emission in Colombia. And only the emission of the economy sector were 160,000 gigagrams in 2018. Your literature want and all developing a CGE model that integrates economic balance with energy, environment, and technological change. Other papers that we look was the Plant and Coach, which they analyze the impact of climate change in the agriculture sector of India. The Rohan Kind built a DGE model using Argumenton and Mielix models to analyze the impact of reducing carbon emission by 37% in 2030. In Colombia, Sousa et al. Analyzed the economy's impact of ETs in Colombia by designing an emission model in the MEC4T model. This model was developed by the planning department of the Colombian department. Another paper is Calderon et al. Analyzed the implementation of the carbon tax and emission reduction target in Colombia using partial equilibrium models, TIANT and GCA, and two CGE models, Phoenix and the MEC4C. For the execution of our model, we employed a combination of constant transformation elasticity function, which represent the technology for production or consumer preference. The model has the 12 product and economic sectors, and it also has company in monopolistic competition and using three types of resources: capital, unqualified, and qualified labor, because it tries to represent the fundamental characteristic of the Colombian employment market. And also we use the Amos ideal demand system, and our model consider the impact of the COVID pandemic. We make the model has no linear programming, and we solve it using GANs. This is, I think, is very standard TG model. We make emission model to analyze the impact of the impact of the carbon tax environmental target. The first one start in 2021 with $50 per 1,000 gigagrams of greenhouse emission, and increase by 4% per year until the year 2030. And we set up a environment target, which is a gradual greenhouse emission reduction of the 2% per year until 2030. We performed a comparative analysis between the past scenarios without reduction emissions, and alternative scenarios with them. The first result is the change of the greenhouse gases emissions. By 2030, it produced a reduction of greenhouse gas emission by 21%, but it's only for economy sector. We are not analyze the follow sector, agriculture, land use, forestry. We only take account economic sector in this paper. And here is the change of reproduction per sector, the 12 sector that we are using. The cost equivalent is 0.8% of annual GDP, and it will accumulate about 18 trillion Colombian pesos, about $20 billion in the period considered, which represented over 7% of the GDP in the 2019. Moreover, the employment rate would raise about the 2%. The industrial sector. The industrial sector is the most affected, with a difference of the 2.5%, followed by the mining sector, followed by the mining sector with the 1.42%. Well, to conclude, the carbon taxes and the environment target are a good instrument to reduce emissions. However, it has a minimal effect in the environment and cause negative economic impact. Maybe another political policy should have like a cap and trade system can be more helpful in the economy. And we consider it important to carry out an analysis of the air-produced emission, because it, for a developing country, represents the 55% of the emission. And maybe other approach would be considered is the technological progress of the new efficient carbon technology. And now we are working to make a linking between the CG model and electricity export market to analyze the energy transition in the electricity generation. So I think it's a very small model that we are working to analyze the impact of the environment policy in Colombia, but we are still to improve it. So thank you for everyone.
Thank you very much, Marcos, for your presentation. So we'll go with the discussion. So please feel free to use the chat to ask your questions. I don't see one yet, so see. So I will join Iman to say welcome to the GTAP community. So
thank you.
His question is how the revenue from the proposed tax is distributed.
The question is okay.
The carbon tax that is
okay. Yes, we use. Let me see the presentation. Okay, we calculate the emission rate per sector. So if for the 50, we start with the $50 per 1,000 gigagrams, and it's equal for the whole sector. Yes.
And how does it goes to the goes to the general government revenue, or is the revenue from this tax used for something else?
In this model, it goes to the general government revenue, the general government.
Okay. So I have another question from Rafael Garrafa. So which also wish you welcome. So his comment is that unemployment growth is a strong message. And did you consider any alternatives in the carbon revenue recycling to reduce this employment effect? For instance, you could reduce labor taxes or other options. Did you consider that?
No, in his model, no. We are working to improve this model with other things. For example, we are taking consider the transition, the energy transition, and maybe the taxes, the carbon taxes should go to the forest, the green project, but we are in this model, we are not considered that in.
Thank you. Cedric Hodge is asking, do you have results for the energy mix? And did you make any assumptions regarding the improved learning rates for renewables?
No. We are working with another paper that we are using as for electricity as for market, that we are taking account about the generation, and we are in this model, in that model, we are linking the CG model with another with a spot market. In that model, we can consider the energy mixes.
Thank you. We have another question from Iman, which is, what are the factors that affect sectoral differences in the, I guess, in the production variation you showed? Is it energy intensity, and how does it show up in the results?
Okay, I think in this paper this is very simple. This DG model, we are not consider the energy intensity in this paper. We are working to improve this model to take these things.
And maybe so. Why is in your opinion, why is the industry sector then more impacted than the other sectors?
I don't understand the question. You can repeat, please.
Yes, of course. In your results, you showed us that the industry sector was the most impacted in terms of production. So why is it that this sector is particularly affected compared to other, like agricultural sectors or services?
Okay, yes. The industrial sector is a sector with the most emission rate right now in Colombia. So this maybe for that reason is the most affected with the carbon taxes, but maybe we can consider the technical progress in this sector. Maybe now they are using old machines. In the next year they can change the machine and improve the emission, but we are not taking account in this part.
Okay, I will go with the next questions from Iman because I think it's related. So where does the information on sectoral greenhouse gas emissions comes from in your data set?
Okay, the information we get from DANE. DANE is a government institute, the Statistical Institute. So we are taking information for the public information in the page of DANE.
Thank you. We have a question from Yongxia Tsai. So the question is, both carbon tax and abatement targets are exogenous in the model. So how are they implemented in the model to meet the emission target? Maybe to rephrase, because that's a question I also had,
Okay.
is the current carbon tax that the government has implemented starting in 2021 isn't sufficient to attain the objectives. So how did you implement that in the model?
Okay, we have in the cost of the company, we use a monopolistic competition. So in the cost of the business, they have to pay for the emission that they make.
I'm sorry. Okay, could you elaborate? I think I didn't get it.
Okay. Yes. The cost of the governmentary are just exogenous. They are implemented in the cost of the company. They have to pay depending of the production. We will use the same emission rate every year. So if produce more of because we don't have the chain technology, we have to assume that they will not change the machine, the technology. So if so the company have to pay tax for the emission depending of the production.
Okay, so on top of the existing tax, so you have an additional tax to match the emission targets, if I understood well. And do you have an idea of the level? Is it much more than what is already foreseen by the Colombian government, or is it comparable? The required level of taxation to achieve the emission targets?
I think is now the emission tax is totally different. Is only for the fossil for use of fossil energy, but not for the emission.
Okay. So we have another question from Cedric Hodge. So given that you have monopolistic competition, is there a chance that some of the carbon tax should actually act as a tax on economic rents? If so, you would think it wouldn't be as damaging as you've shown. Do you have an implied marginal excess burden figure for the carbon tax?
No, I don't have an implant of manager access. So maybe I should study this part.
And have you looked at the effect on the market, maybe, of your carbon tax? on the firm's markup?
Yes, maybe, I think.
Sorry?
You can ask me again, please.
Have you looked in your results? I guess you have a kind of Krugman style or Merit style imperfect competition, which means that countries charge a markup. And have you looked at how the markup reacts to the simulations that you've done with the carbon pricing? So are profits increasing or are they reducing following the taxation?
Okay. Yes. They reduce the production following the taxation. I think the price also changed, but is the company decide to, maybe the behavior of the company decide to produce less and don't pay more emission taxes. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for my English.
Mine is not much better. And I also want to relay a proposal by Cedric Hodge. If you want to chat about this, offline is offering some help. So I just wanted to relay the offer. Is there any other question for the remaining few minutes of the discussion? Otherwise, I have one more about your perception of how this carbon taxation is happening in Colombia. Is it something that is well accepted by the citizens and the firms, or is it not that much accepted?
I am from Ecuador. I am studying in Colombia, but so I don't have a lot of background in here in Colombia. But yeah, I think it's very difficult to the people accept the maybe new taxes that you see in the news about the program, the social program, about because the government tried to imply a new taxes program, and the new tax program have more green taxes, but the people, they didn't like that. So I think it's very difficult to implement here in Colombia.
And are there some discussions on how it can be put in place, but in a satisfactory way for everybody, like redistribution of revenues or exemptions for certain categories of persons?
Okay. Now I think now nobody are discussing about the taxes because the people was angry with in the last month. I think it's bad idea to start to discussing about taxes. So now the government don't have a new project about taxes in general or green taxes for the country.
Okay, so thank you very much. If there is no more question, I will thank you one last time, and we will take a few minutes to prepare the next presentation, which will be from Cedric Hodge. So I must apologize to those of you who just joined us. We had to change the order of presenters and switch the first and the last one. So that's why that's what Hu Sheng is presenting now. Cedric, maybe you can take a few seconds to test if everything is working again well. Perfect. So, so the next presenter is Cedric Hodge from Deloitte Access Economics, and he's going to present us his work on CG modeling of the net impact from Australia's transition to a low-carbon economy. So, Cedric, thanks for accepting to change the order, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. And hello, everyone. It's good to see we've got a fairly international audience, as you'd expect at GTAP. And so I realised some of what I'm presenting here, you might be, there might be similarities to the countries that you're living or working in, and some of them might be unique. And so if there's anything along the way that's that you don't understand, we can go back through it in the Q&A. But Australia's in a pretty unique position, would be the best way to put it. We're the driest, inhabited continent, as Professor Whitwer is sage to remind us in his presentations. And obviously we've got a lot of coastline, and it's very warm. And we're very dependent on tourism. So you would imagine that we have a lot to lose from potential climate change impacts over time. And I think that's basically been the conventional wisdom in Australia and probably globally for the better part of a decade or two now. Having said that, there's not been a great deal of work done in Australia on putting a dollar figure on the potential economic impacts of climate change. There's been a lot of work in Australia done on mitigation. In fact, you would probably argue that a lot of the modelling work you see done today in other countries, large parts of it were started in Australia with people like Peter Dixon and Maureen Rimmer and Philip Adams and those from the Centre of Policy Studies, and so it was a bit of a shame, I guess, that over that period so much work was done on the potential harm from mitigation, and so little was done on the potential harm from inaction, right? And then very little was done on the potential kind of net impact, right, of moving from a no action baseline or a medium action baseline to an ambitious action scenario. Having said that, people in Australia, including Professor Dom Compass, have done work on it over time, and it's gotten some press, but I think it'd be fair to say that it wasn't necessarily in the mainstream, right? And so what we sought to do at Deloitte Access Economics was do that. And as consultants, the best way we could think of to do that was to put it in terms of shiny infographics and diagrams. And so you'll have to forgive me, I guess, for an academic audience. You probably it's fair to say that kind of things are oversimplifications to a sophisticated crowd like this. But in Australia and in other countries, when you're in the policy debate and you're talking to companies and different stakeholders, they're not so interested in monopolistic competition and marginal excess burden. They're a bit more interested in big shiny numbers, and so that's what we've tried to do here. So I've labelled this slide a new choice with an asterisk because I didn't view it as a new choice, but the title of the report that we released, which is publicly available and you can look up, is A New Choice: Australia's Climate for Growth, which was released last year. And what that report does is use a large-scale CGE model in concert with a climate model and damages functions to lay out the potential future for the Australian economy under a kind of extreme no action scenario, and then under an extreme action scenario, net zero type scenario, rapid decarbonisation. And what you can see here on this slide is two pages of that report, which show the potential impact of inaction in dollar terms, in net present value dollar terms over the period to 2070, and the potential average annual jobs lost, which was the far more influential figure, contrasted with the potential economic gain, again in terms of GDP net present value over the period, noting that it's net of the damages, and the potential employment gain, again, the far more influential figure. And so, you know, they're big numbers. I'm not going to go into them too much here, but needless to say, they got a fair bit of press, which was the point of the report, right? So so I shouldn't be upset about that. Not all of it was positive, right? If you were to judge it from left to right, as I've presented it here, from our Australian Broadcasting Corporation through to the newspaper, The Australian, there was, you know, I'd say a kind of like concerted effort to highlight figures that we were raising and the points we were trying to make in the report from agencies like the ABC and the Guardian and the Fairfax papers. And then if you go over to the Australian, you know, there was a different point of view put forward by others, including the economics editor Adam Crichton and Judith Sloan and well, actually. And so, as you all would have experienced at some point when your work does, you know, reach any kind of public prominence, if it's on climate, you're going to attract some criticism, no matter what you do, no matter how good it is. Even, you know, Wisheng's presentation, which I thought was excellent. I imagine if you go to present that in the wrong places in Europe or anywhere, they're going to have some strong views, right? And it's got nothing to do with how good you are at economics. So, so keeping that in mind, I wanted to show here, you know, is what we did really all that fear-mongering, as Adam would say? And what I'm showing here in the table is just a really kind of simple, pretty crude comparison of the economic damages that we found, keeping in mind that 880,000 jobs lost and 3.4 trillion. Obviously, those are, you know, designed to be big numbers, but percentage deviations are what we all know and love in the CGE community, and that's what's presented here in the damages column. For a range of scenarios, unfortunately, not every person who's done this has done the exact same scenario to make it easy for us. And so there are a range here, and in some cases there's a range of years, and in some cases, you know, a different region is shown because it's not, you know, I couldn't find, not everyone did Australia, funnily enough, and not everyone gave global figures. But what you can see here, again noting that it is crude, but by design, is that the potential damages from a, you know, a reasonably high level of warming, which obviously we hope won't occur, but could range, but are generally very large, right? Percents of GDP, as you've seen in dollar figures before, add up pretty quickly in terms of cumulative deviations. And, you know, at the upper end, 30%, 25%, I think that's what you would call catastrophic, right? So we're not talking about modest impacts here, we're talking about catastrophic impacts. Now, our report, which we, again, you know, probably through function of the, you know, the place that Deloitte Access Economics is designed to be pretty conservative, right? And so you can see that our figure is not the highest, it's not the lowest, but it's definitely not the highest. And so, you know, I guess, you know, my point would be that it, you know, it sits well within this band of published research. So what have we done? What are we using to do this work? We're using a model which we now call Declimate. And again, you'll have to forgive me, I didn't come up with that name. I don't get to choose some of these things. But essentially what it is a version of GTAP dying, I guess is what you would call it, with obviously non-CO2 emissions, with GTAP, the GTAP power database incorporated. We've corrected for a few issues with industrial process emissions not being accounted for in parts of the database, and obviously, you know, regionalised parts of it to look at Australia at a sub-national level. So if you think about, you know, GTAP's basic behaviour, I think you would find that in our core economic model, and you know, and like a lot of people will present, it's a variant where we've made, you know, modifications, including things like endogenous unemployment, so that, you know, you don't get asked the age-old question, what closure did you use, a short run or a long run closure? You know, and there are local currency units in here, so there's not the issue with the trade balance like there is in other models. And so that's the core economic model, but that's obviously one part of it. That's what we would call DAE RGEM, which is the part you see on the bottom left of this diagram, and also bottom right. Now we run that with an economic baseline to produce an economic baseline and an associated emissions profile, and then we put those emissions through Magic 7 now, the climate emulator or model, which obviously is used, by a bunch of people, and it forms part of the IPCC process. So it's a very reputable model to be using for things like that. And we then pull out climate variables like change in average global mean temperature, and we do some efforts to regionalise that, some dynamic downscaling, and CO2 concentrations, and we feed those into damage functions, which you'll see in the next couple of slides. The damage functions obviously do what their name suggests. They produce an implied, kind of cost or damage associated with a given temperature increase, and those are then fed through back into the CGE model to assess the kind of resulting kind of combined impact, because there's more than one damage, obviously, as you'll see soon, and they have second round impacts. And so what we're interested in is, if you were to look at this as a comparison of an economic baseline, which we've all seen before, and an economic baseline which includes damages, then what's the implied cost of those damages? How much are we losing because of those damages? And that's the figure that you saw on the left of the second slide I presented. So one of the criticisms made at the time was that we used RCP 8.5, right? And it was labelled as extreme and perhaps a bit out of date. And, in some ways that's probably fair enough. In other ways, we were developing a lot of this stuff from our end, like we were kind of, developing it or learning it for the first time. And so we're relying on damage estimates that came from RCP 8.5. So it was kind of a deliberate decision at the time. We've since updated it to RCP 6, and, I'm not giving away too much to let you know that the damage is still really bad. So maybe that criticism isn't all that valid. And I guess the other thing to note here is, I think, that's basically it in a nutshell, and happy to take questions in the Q&A period of that. So the damage functions, the key bit. So at a conceptual level, what we're trying to do here is translate a change in temperature or CO2 into an economic change, right? And so if you were to look at this diagram that I have on the right here, you've got a change in average temperature, and that can produce a kind of associated damage, because obviously temperature by itself is not the concern. You might get more extreme or frequent weather events, dry conditions, acidification, sea level rises, and things like that. We then translate those into an impact type, right? Because those aren't variables in the model. We translate those into an impact type, and then that feeds into the production function of the model, as it were. And so if you were to take sea level rise as an example, there's a pretty well-established link between the projected increase in temperature and the projected sea level rise. And then there's a pretty well-established literature on the link between sea level rise and a loss of agricultural land on one end, and on dwelling or kind of like private capital on the other end. And so that's fed through the CG model. And so that's done at a at a yearly time step and at a regional level to produce a local and time sensitive impact. So there's a big, like I said, there's a big literature on these things. It's not like we're the first person the first people to ever come up with this. And all we're really trying to do, I think, in a lot of ways, is perhaps add a voice to the debate. Obviously, coming at it from the angle of economic consulting, we're probably moving in kind of different circles and probably trying to put a bit more gloss on it, perhaps than is the fashion in academia. But we also did try to push the envelope a little bit in terms of building off Rossen and Sartori 2016, as almost everyone has. But adding in like an augmentation, I guess, is what you would say, to one of the key damages, the heat stress damage, where we've instead of relying on their function as it was, we've gone to updated literature from Kellstrom in 2017, and we've added in a capital damage that wasn't in Rossen and Sartori. So so here you see the 6 damage functions which enter the model. And so you've got sea level rise, which I talked about, crop yields, which obviously, people that other than me will know a lot more about that than I will, but health impacts, morbidity and mortality, tourism, the change in net inflows. Obviously, like I said, in Australia, it's quite a key thing. Heat stress and labour productivity is the dominant one, and capital productivity, which probably the best way to think about is actually infrastructure. You know, so as it gets hotter, the roads start to crack. You know, they require more repair and things like that. That's probably the way to think about that one. So sea level rise, I won't bore people too much with these equations. All this stuff's available online. But I guess what I'm trying to show here is that, you know, we've tried to estimate a function. Like I said, the sea level isn't a variable in the model. And even if it was, you know, you've then got to link it to something economic to get a damage out of it. And that's what we've tried to do here. I guess the key thing to note is that, you know, like, I guess, you know, sharing a bit of a war story is looking at, to calculate this, right, and this is probably something that you've heard before, there's a lot more work in calculating the shock than there is in running the model for this one. So if you're looking at, for example, the loss of agricultural land, you have to work out how much agricultural land is coastal. In some places, it's obviously zero because they're landlocked, and in some places, it's a very high number, and you've got to go to GIS data and work it out. And so there's a lot of, you know, I guess basically just data work to come up with that. The same is true of the non-agricultural sea level rise damage. So if you think houses, coastal inundation, you know, businesses that are located near the coast and things like that, that's harder again, obviously, because you know, with agricultural land, it's probably more akin to that kind of like straight quantity reduction or straight productivity loss. Whereas when you're talking about losing coastal land, you know, in most countries, I think this is pretty common. Those tend to be pretty expensive houses, and they tend to be or businesses. And so, you know, you've got to try and make some effort to capture the value that's lost rather than just the kind of pure quantity. When it comes to agriculture, you know, one of the hard things was a lot of the literature that we came across was on very specific crops like maize, which aren't big crops in Australia, obviously. And so, you know, we've had to make some, you know, assumptions to adapt to that. And those are, you know, obviously imperfect and will get refined over time as scientists in Australia and other countries do more research. But this is one of the few ones in which you've obviously got a change in average temperature and a change in CO2 concentrations, because that obviously feeds into how plants grow. And this is probably one of the few damages in which you get a pretty nonlinear response. And so, for example, the damages associated with lower emissions, you know, scenarios like like a net zero scenario or an RCP 2.6 or something like that, they tend to be pretty mild, if not a little bit positive in some regions. And so, yeah, there's a bit of non-linearity going on in this one. Human health, you know, is obviously a big one. It's, you know, your health is your wealth, and what we've done here is obviously, you know, relied on Roslin and Sartori, tried to, I guess, like slightly augmented or updated it where we can. But to be honest, this is probably one of the ones that we've done the least, I guess, work on, so to speak. And that's not because we don't think it's important. I think it's just we couldn't find, you know, better information than was already available on Ross and Sartori. But essentially, what you're getting here is an implied reduction in you know, labour supply or effective labour productivity, right? From an increase in mortality and morbidity over time as the temperature increases. How we holiday is obviously, well, it's a bit different now with COVID, but you know, we knew that going into it. But generally speaking, when it's not a global pandemic, you know, global tourism is a huge industry, and it's projected to change with the changing climate. Places in Australia that people typically like to go, especially international tourists, tend to be pretty warm, and getting a bit warmer isn't necessarily going to make them a lot nicer, would be the best way to put it, and especially getting more humid. Which is probably a good segue, actually, to go into how workers work, which is the key kind of departure we made from Russell and Sartori, and well, a key in the sense that it drives a lot of the result. And what we're trying to calculate here is the WBGT, which is the wet bulb global temperature, and of the simplest way I've heard it explained basically is it accounts for humidity as well. And so obviously, you know, it just getting warmer, it being a dry heat is one thing, but obviously as it gets more humid, there's a much more marked reduction in physiological in the physiological estimation of work capacity, which obviously we're linking here to labour productivity, which is obviously an economic concept being linked to a physiological concept. So yeah, that's that one. What is built and how it's damaged. Yeah, like I said, this one is probably akin, I would say, to thinking about infrastructure damages. You know, as the global temperature rises, it's going to put stress on a lot of key infrastructure, especially. And so we've sought out specific data sets and specific research to augment that, because we thought that was a kind of a key one to include. I guess it's a bit of a lesson in life in that you do a lot of work to get these things in there, and it turns out that heat stress still dominates the result, as you can see in the report that we put out. But nonetheless, it's worth including, and a lot of the value of some of this stuff is doing it individually, as other authors like McKibben and Compass and others have, and showing the relative impacts, because that can help kind of tell the story and give the reader a bit more comfort, in the results. So that's the damages side, right? And like I said, happy to take questions on that. The paper's publicly available. Happy to chat about it offline. It's a continuing stream of work for us and refinement. But on the policy side, especially given the session we've just had, I thought it would be good for me to kind of share some kind of really open questions that are in my mind, and you've probably seen them play out in my questions in the chat here. And just for context, I guess it's worth flagging, I've been doing this for a little while now, like a bit over a decade, first as a kind of honours student, and then working at the Commonwealth Treasury in Australia on carbon pricing, and then obviously in the private sector at Deloitte. And I've seen the CGE community slowly kind of evolve on some of these issues, but I'd say it's definitely there's room to go. Would be my observation, and obviously I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, and so I can't go out there and fix some of these problems. But here I'm just going to share with you some kind of open questions I've got in my mind. It might well be that there's really good answers that I just haven't read the paper for or something like that. So happy to be informed if that's the case. When it comes to modelling policy, right, in Australia, like I said, very unique. How do you model a policy that doesn't exist? So in Australia, we don't have a net zero target, and hence my question earlier, and that's quite controversial at the moment. But in plenty of places they do, and they have them recently announced. What does that really mean? Like, is that the same as swapping out emissions in a CG model and forcing them to get to a certain level and using, the share carbon price as the constraint? Is that really, the best way to go about that? Is that how the policy will actually be achieved? Or is it maybe something a bit more intertemporal? And that was what I was getting at with the investment question I had before. And even in countries where they have policies, like we just saw in the last presentation, they have a very low starting carbon price, or even in the EU, they have a carbon price now that probably won't get them there. That's basically true in almost every country, right? How do you start to layer up things? And that's why I think Wishen's presentation was really great, because he really had done the work to work in a bunch of different policies and combinations thereof to show you how how they could play out. And so that's something that I have in my mind. Emissions constraints versus carbon taxes. Obviously, carbon taxes are legislated in some places, not in everywhere. Some places have made Paris pledges, have made net zero pledges, have legislated in the case of the UK. How do you model that? How do you model a legislated reduction? Again, going back to that question I just raised before, how do you set appropriate substitution parameters for decarbonisation? Obviously, we typically try to pick parameters based on econometric evidence, and where that doesn't exist, basically, I think a lot of the time I wouldn't say guessing, but we're picking them based on kind of like first principles, right? And so in this case, obviously, the econometric evidence isn't going to get you there. There's not been nearly the rate of switching to electric vehicles that we think needs to happen to get to net zero. So what's the point in running an economic model with, a really rigid elasticity based on the observed switching to date? And if that's not what you're going to do, then how do you choose them? I still just don't know, basically. when and how to apply technological improvements, as we saw in the second presentation, they play a huge part in any simulation of carbon pricing or of emissions reductions, and how we apply them is not yet clear in my mind. One way I've come around to over time is the idea of setting a constraint, you know, in, let's say with a legislated target, letting the model solve for that constraint to produce an endogenous carbon price, and then imposing that carbon price and then layering on some kind of technological improvement, which you could calibrate based on the amount of uptake of the technology you saw without the improvement, i.e. there's a rate of switching, people switch to renewables, for example, that encourages faster learning. You know, that was kind of Ken Arrow's original idea. And so if you do it that way, you know, that's one way to go about it, but I'm open to other suggestions, you know, and just saying solar PV's fallen by, you know, 80% in 10 years is good. And it's great that it's happened, like I'm not against it. What does that say about what's going to happen in the future? And what does that say about what's going to happen with hydrogen? Because solar PV is, you know, one part of it and hydrogen is another part of it. And then the elephant in the room in my mind, and this came to the last presentation, was what do you do about non-combustion emissions? Like these models, like I said, have been around for a long time in Australia and other places, and I think have been doing a pretty good job of showing trade-offs and the choices and things like that. But in this case, I just feel like we're a little way off getting to where we need to be. And in some countries, we've been doing a bit of work in APAC recently, in other countries, you know, it's a huge part of the inventory. If you look at Australia, you know, because we've been such a laggard, we could probably get, you know, a good, I don't know, 30% of the way there on our target by just making some pretty obvious and kind of rational choices in our energy system. But then after that, those need to flow through to transport. And then after that, those need to flow through to households or concurrently. And then after that, there's not easy choices left. Agriculture, industrial process emissions, fugitive emissions from mining and things like that. You know, I'm still going to need to mine some things. There'll be some fugitive emissions associated with those, you know, paddy rice, cement production and things like that. I just feel like we don't quite have the best idea of how to do that currently. Next steps. So in our work or in other work generally, where are we going to next? Looking at combining acute and chronic damages. You know, I guess my kind of high level observation would be that the acute damages have been the realm of the actuaries up until now, and the chronic damages have probably been more the realm of the CG modelers or the econometricians. But you know, they're always, there's not one or the other, right? They're both going to happen, and in reality, there's going to be a combination of them. And if you look at chronic damage functions now, like heat stress, you know, there's probably not much of an acute kind of phenomena going on there, but then if you look at capital damages, there definitely is, right? And so while there might be a long run view or a chronic view on capital damages, there's also a very acute view, and you would say the acute's dominant. So how do you marry the two together is something we're obviously looking at and happy to take suggestions on. Adding in more damages or refining those we have currently, or a combination of those two things. You know, not a day goes by that someone doesn't say, do you have X in here? Like, you know, they say sea level rise and we say yes, but then they'll say bushfires, or they'll say, you know, what happens if the tundra melts or something. You know, someone's always got something that they're asking you to have considered, and you invariably haven't considered all of them. And so adding those in over time, but really we're going to have to be guided by the literature. And so hopefully people like yourselves and others are doing really good work that we can draw on, or refining the ones we have currently. You know, be fair to say we're not climate modelers, and our use of Magic 7 and other, you know, and the damage functions in general is slowly improving and getting more regionalised is the term I'd use, or, you know, we're downscaling as much as we can, and that's showing some interesting results in terms of heterogeneity. They're not, you know, surprising results, but they're interesting, and I think that's something we'll continue to do over time. Accounting for tail risk, obviously, like every, you know, model that was probably been presented at GTAP this year and for most years, our model's deterministic, right? And so that for climate change questions, that, you know, that has its limits, and they're pretty hard limits when it comes to probabilistic outcomes and tail risk. And so what do we do there? You know, it's not going to be a medium, low, high answer. It's going to be something a bit more sophisticated than that. But I'd be very interested in people's thoughts. The big one in the damages space is, is what you've done, does it account for adaptation, right? And that was a big critique of the work we put out. I will just adapt, it'll be fine. Everyone's 5 times richer by 2100 or 2070. Like, stop worrying. And, while you'd like to believe that's true, probably not going to be true globally. And we are applying these damages, which are estimated often from kind of econometric evidence. That econometric evidence is conducted in a setting in which things are changing all the time and adapting all the time. So you'd almost say that the damages themselves include a bit of adaptation, I would posit, and they're applied to an economic model with substitution and flexibility. So, if heat stress, affects labour productivity, that's not the end of the world for the model. It can try to substitute away from labour and still produce goods and services. And so, I would say we are basically accounting for adaptation, but we're definitely not accounting for the foregone investment that would be present to pay for these things. I'm guessing that's a time warning. And
yes, it's overdue, but we were enjoying it. So let's.
Sorry, and this is my last point. So trying to derive an optimal response, and that comes down to temporal behaviour, which we don't have in our model. Some people do, but yeah, happy to take comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Cedric. So we already have since you asked a lot of questions during your presentation, there are a lot of not necessarily answers, but at least reactions in the chat. So let's start with the first one. So the first one is Iman, who asked you if you could elaborate a bit on heat stress and WBGT. When calculating the cost, did you consider any adaptation regarding that? Following your last slide, I guess, maybe not. And how about the possibility and costs of adaptation?
Yeah, that's a great question. With that specific damage, it would fall into the category of I guess one that's estimated in a way that accounts for. No, sorry, that's a bad answer. Think about it this way: heat stress affects labour productivity, right? So I'm working in a farm, right? And if the temperature is going to increase by 3 degrees on average, there's going to be months of the year and parts of the day in every month and things like that where I just can't work, right? And you could come up with some kind of air-conditioned suit or something like that, right? to get me out there, or you might get more mechanization. So splitting those two apart, the damage itself doesn't account for the fact that there might be some innovation like a drug or something like that which allows people to work in increased temperatures. So it doesn't have that kind of phenomena in there. It does have the second part, which would be if it's harder for people to go out and work in fields, right, or factories or whatever, then the model can try and substitute away to capital, right? And so there's that kind of, I guess, like production function type adaptation, but there's not what I'd call maybe like the direct level adaptation built in there. So that's why I'm saying it's still a bit of kind of like an open question in my mind. Like, would you say it accounts for it or not? I don't have a good answer yet.
Yeah, thanks. That was enough.
So I think I will take Garafa's questions first because it relates to this one. So given that mining and ONG sectors are key sectors in Australia's economy, he was wondering how this message was taken by big players in this sector, particularly how they react to the impact on heat stress and labor productivity, besides the discussion you already had with the RCP 8.5 issue. So specifically on the labor productivity, do they react and how? Yeah,
it's like I said, as someone who's been doing this for over a decade now, the one thing I would say is quite remarkable has been the shift in the private sector. When Australia introduced the carbon price, it was decried straight away from certain parts of of the Australian business sector, and it was quickly repealed, right? And if we fast forward to now, we often do work for mining companies, Australia's big mining companies and big global mining companies, who are very aware of climate change impacts like heat stress, and are very cognizant of the shift that needs to occur and are positioning themselves for that shift. And so that's the one thing I'm quite optimistic on. So I guess a better answer would be, it's not like we've copped blowback from miners who say, oh, that's rubbish, that's not what's going to happen, or you've picked an extreme scenario or something like that. They're just as kind of aware of this stuff as we are, really, and they're kind of pushing for action so that they can continue to do business, mining other commodities and selling other things to people.
Thank you. Maybe to on this question too. So you mentioned that you were having on average a 6% damage, aggregate damage. Do you have an idea on overall which sectors are the more impacted? Where are there more job losses, and where the impacts are lower, or is it something that we implement uniformly over the economy?
Yeah, it's a funny one, in the sense that it's a very broad-based shock if you were to look at it in aggregate, but that's because it involves things that affect, if you think about primary, secondary, tertiary, it affects all those segments of your economy in different ways. So agriculture is very negatively affected because of crop yields, and because of labour productivity, and because of agricultural land being lost to sea level rise. But it's not necessarily a standout. Mining, there's similar things going on, except for the sea level rise. They suffer from the capital damages because they're very capital intensive. Then, manufacturing, probably manufacturing, you'd say, is the one that's kind of maybe in the middle a little bit. But then the services sector, accounts for 77% of employment in Australia. And while the labour productivity impacts are lesser there, you've got tourism, which is a big part of the services sector in Australia, and you've got a generally depressed economy, right? And the income elasticity is kicking in, and people are consuming services, and so no sector really gets away with it, so to speak. There's no winners, that's for sure, in that scenario. There's just different shades of losers, and I wouldn't say anyone's a clear standout.
Thank you. No, there is a comment by Hannu Savolainen, who says you made a very good point relating the non-energy based greenhouse gas emissions. He suggests that what one can do is to attach the emissions to output of different industries, and if you don't assume technological change concerning those emissions, you get the figures through monetary values. So I think he's referring to the marginal abatement cost curves that you can have regarding the outputs. And he also proposes to look even deeper to identify which products in the process generate those emissions and follow that product's use. So I've never heard of this alternative, but I don't know if it's something you considered.
The first one is definitely something we have considered, and we have, I wouldn't call them MAC curves. They're probably more akin to emissions response parameters, in the sense that they're not costed, right, by some kind of bottom-up analysis. We just have a function where if the carbon price gets to a certain level, then certain reductions become viable. And depending on, again, going back to my question about parameters, depending about what you assume for that curve, that can really change the result, right? And so, yeah, I guess maybe it's a bit like what the question's getting at with a very specific looking at products, or you take the presentation that Wushan gave where he's got a really specific list of abatements that someone's going for, and you say, cement, for example, current technology is obviously not there. Here's the investment pipeline based on an analysis of previous breakthroughs in other sectors. Here's a range of, kind of periods in which we think we're going to be able to solve for it. and here's how much we think it's going to cost. And I could see how you would build that in. That becomes an exercise in itself, right? And it should be, because it's really important. But so that's a good point. The product point especially, right? Because you've got industries, and then that's a good point.
So thank you. Yes, Ivan?
I think we are out of time. I have to go to another session too. So very quick comments and questions if you want to have, and then we have to go.
That was what I was saying. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much specifically to the 4 presenters and the very interesting discussions we had. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and wish you a good day or evening, depending on where you are.